This happened to me 2 or 3 years ago. I was around 23 at the time. I'm a female and I live in Romania. One night I was coming home from class. Classes start after 6 p.m. and end at 10 p.m. At around 11 p.m. I had to take the subway for about 12 stops. The destination I had to get off was the end of the line for the subway. At that time, there wouldn't be many people in the subway. I'm a pretty lonely person. All I need is my headset and my music and I'm good to go. Said and done, I plug in my music, I pick up the furthest chair in the subway, away from the only two people that were taking the subway at that time. So far so good, until I see, with the corner of my eye, a silhouette approaching me and sitting right next to me. It was a man, fairly built, dark hair, wearing glasses, a black shirt with a black hoodie and sickening smile. He doesn't engage in talking with me, but would just stare at my phone as I would browse through my music. I can hear him breathing heavily. Not like painfully, but still like he was feeling something very strongly. I feel uneasy, so I decide to change my seat and go even further behind, trying to avoid him without looking like I'm freaking myself out. I don't know to whom, there must have been one other person the whole way. I guess that scared me even more. I pick a chair, sit down, plug in my headset again, and proceed with the remaining 6 out of 12 stops on my way home. I see the silhouette growing bigger and bigger, and a breeze running on my skin as I realise the guy is again sitting right next to me, glancing in mid-air, dead eyes, a big smile, staring right into my phone. I panic. There's still 4 stops to go. I have nowhere to hide. I look after the other person in the subway, trying to sit next to her, thinking that strength comes in numbers. She's no longer there. I start shaking a bit, not allowing the creeper to notice me being vulnerable. I stand up, go to the door, and decide to just stand on my own until my stop comes. This way he won't sit next to me, right? Wrong. He comes straight after me and sits in the chair right next to the door, and because he couldn't see my phone, which he was so focused on, from that angle, he fixates right on my soul with his black dead eyes and says, "Hi gorgeous, why are you avoiding me?" I'm freaking out as I look at my phone trying to call my boyfriend or message him, and he stops me by saying, "I know no one will help you. You would have sent an SOS message by now. I know you didn't." In that moment, I realise I'm cornered. He's been focusing on my phone to see who I was talking to, trying to figure out if I panic, trying to see if I'd ask someone for help. He cornered me bad. I had the luck to reach my stop, as I would delay any reaction to ignore him, so he'd repeat whatever he wanted to say. I'd drop off and run to the exit, not looking back. I get out at the surface, and I don't see him anymore. My heartbeat comes back to normal, as I know at least I have something to defend myself with, but still a long way to get home. And who knows if he's alone or not. I walk back rather fast for 5 minutes from the metro and feel a hand grabbing my wrist hard and pulling me back. Another hand covering my mouth, disabling me from screaming my lungs out. It was him, the same black hoodie, dark hair and dead-eyed stalker. He was furious and said, "Running from me. How dare you run away from me? You should be honoured that I give you my attention. I'm fairly built for a woman, 80 kg and 1.75 metres tall, so I guess he thought men don't find me beautiful or something, and should feel blessed that a creep like him stalks me and tries to hurt me. Now my phone is in my bag, I can't call the police, I can't reach for the pepper spray. I panic, I can't punch him in the crotch, I can't scratch him as I don't have long nails, his hand is still in my mouth. What do I do? I did the most desperate and disgusting thing that I could think of to save my life. I played along. I used my other hand to touch the inside of his thigh and mumble, "I'm sorry," while his hand was in my mouth. He took his hand off my mouth, and I repeated that I'm sorry. I didn't realise that he was just flirting. He left his guard down and took his hand off my wrist. He asked my phone number and my address to drop me off, but I refused, saying that I'd rather add him on Facebook, and he agreed. I told him I'd reached my phone, but instead picked the pepper spray and sprayed him all over his face, made sure to cover both his eyes, nose, mouth, and even his ears and hands. He instantly got all red, suffocating from the pepper and swelling. I called the police, told them what happened, and what I did. They asked me if he's immobilised, and I said yes, as the effect wears off in 45 minutes. The police arrived 5 minutes later to see me shaking like a leaf, and the man on the ground, swollen like a pumpkin, throwing up and swearing at me between the gaps of breath. He was arrested, and the police told me that they'd been looking for him for the past week as they discovered the body of a 24-year-old woman in his apartment. A fairly built lady, 1.77 metres tall, 75 kg, red hair. I have red hair too. The woman was his girlfriend, and ever since, he's never got back into the apartment. I do not know what he wanted to do with me. I can understand why he targeted me due to the similarities, but stranger in the subway stalking women at midnight trying to befriend them or even worse, murder them. I hope to God that I never meet you again. I was recently reminded of this story after telling it to some friends. This happened around 2011 when I was still in high school. At the time, I really enjoyed PC gaming and eventually started getting into specific MMORPG. I wasn't really good at it, but wasn't planning to make friends or anything, only joining parties when I absolutely needed to. For a few months, I just logged on and played some quests and did my usual thing. Because it was so long ago, excuse I can't remember all the game-specific terminology. Now, if I remember correctly, the game works as follows. Some areas like cities or towns were public spaces, so when you were there, you'd be able to interact with other people, also currently in their respective gameplay. If someone wasn't actually in your party, you would have no contact with them when entering into a private space outside. One day, when moving into one of the public areas, I was approached by another player, we'll call him Andrew, just chatting and talking to me. He was friendly, and I didn't really get a sense of any sort of danger or red flags. It was a very standard interaction, but also probably one of my first that wasn't quest related. Andrew was friendly and offered to help me with whatever I needed to do in the next game. At some point, he just randomly asked if I'm a girl. My avatar was female, but username didn't really offer any information relating to my gender, so I confirmed, albeit confused, that I am a girl, and that seemed to be it. We continued from there, did the quest, and after adding him as a friend, I logged off eventually. Everything seemed fine. A few days later, I played again, and with what I assume must have been a newfound confidence in my friend-making skills to Andrew, I did a quest with some other people who offered to let me join their guild. I was sort of stoked because I've never had a guild to offer before, so I immediately accepted and joined the guild. Even though it was tiny and unimportant, I was happy. The next day I logged in, and Andrew is also online. The game publicly showed your guild affiliation, and he's immediately, angry I guess. He reprimands me that I shouldn't just join any guild, and demands I leave the guild, because he wanted me to join his guild instead. I'm very confused, but I feel like I've somehow betrayed my friend, so I do as he asks and accept his invitation to join his guild. Though I felt bad for just immediately dropping my previous guild, I do cheer up a bit when I note that Andrew's guild is really high. Next time I log in is when things started getting weird. Just to clarify, I had never exchanged any personal information with Andrew. All he knew about me is that I identify as female. Not only did I value my privacy in game and never exchanged personal information with anyone on there, I never posted on any public forum about the game, never joined a game-related group, and I hadn't even liked it on Facebook. As far as I know, there is no way to link me to my account. But I log in and Andrew greets me in the chat by my full name and surname. Now my username was not related to my actual name, and I never told him anything personal about myself, including my name and surname, so I was very confused. However, I assumed that perhaps since I haven't been playing that long, I just totally didn't understand the mechanisms of the game, and perhaps my name was available somewhere. His messages become weirder and more sexual. I remember him specifically saying, "I can't live not knowing what it feels like to touch your skin," followed by many messages of him speculating what I must smell like. I log off and have no idea what to do. As stupid as I am, I decide to try and freak him out. I do some snooping on my own. I remember all I did was look up the guild's Facebook group, and I think he was one of the admins. He was a guild leader. I believe it wasn't that hard to find him. At this point, I didn't know his full name yet, but he was easy to figure out. Let's say his username in-game was Ancrew, just one letter from the admin called Andrew. Next time I logged back into the game, he was online as well. Once again, he greets me with my full name and surname. I respond with the exact same, since I know what his name is and surname is. However, he's unfazed. He responds by asking me how things are in my neighbourhood and at my school, by naming them both. He knows where I live, he knows where I go to school. I immediately logged off, uninstalled the game, and have never been back. I still don't know how he got that information, since it wasn't publicly available anywhere. I still have his full name and surname, and checked his Facebook a while back out of sheer curiosity. He's a professor at the University of Science and Technology. I never told him a name or anywhere where I live. He knows my name and where I live. Also, he wants to smell me. This story happened when I was 12 years old. I'm female and 25. The story I'm about to tell you might not be the most scary, but for me and my parents it was. It was a Saturday night, around 9 or 10 PM during the summertime. I owned one dog at the time. His name's Benny. My parents decided that night that they felt like going for a walk around the block, walking Benny, and asked me if I wanted to join them. I said no, because I wanted to play PWI on my PC, Perfect World International. My parents were okay with leaving me alone, since a walk wouldn't take longer than 30 minutes tops. As my parents would get dressed to leave the house, I logged into PWI and looked around my guild and global chat to see if anyone was on. For some reason, no one was on, so I decided to join my parents. I get dressed, put Benny on his leash, and we all leave. I'd like to mention that I lived in an apartment building that had 10 floors, and we lived on the very first floor. Not sure how to explain, but you have the basement of the building and then the first row of apartments. Basically, you enter the building and are already facing the apartments. I lived on the very first one. I remember always hating that because whoever would pass by our front door, we could hear, at any time of day or night. Whoever it was lurking at night, we would hear them. It was somewhat eerie to live on floor 0. We leave the house, my dad closes the door, and we had 3 keyholes and a steel bar that would block the door from the inside. The bar covered half the door. Precautions were my father's obsession. We exit the building and enjoy our walk. After 15 minutes, we realised the wind has changed from warm summer wind to incoming storm wind. My mum makes the call to go back home, as Benny already did his duties, so we will return. We open the door, climb the 5 stairs to our door and attempt to open it. My father does the following, unlocks the first 3 doors, and then attempts to unlock the metal bar that holds the door locked. At that moment, my father pauses, turns around at us with the most serious face I've ever seen on him, and whistles for us to call the police and ring the neighbour's door. My mum goes to the second apartment, and the neighbour, who I'll call Ted, comes out and asks my father what happened. My dad whispered to him, covering the see-through hole of the door, "Someone's in the house. He or they are holding the door. Please stay here with my family and attempt to open it. I'll be back." After saying that, I see my father rush, all by himself, around the building in the dark. I say dark because we didn't have great street lights on the other side of our apartment facing the block garden. My dad disappears into the darkness. I go outside too, not following him too much, but only to hear that he's in trouble. He's my dad, don't judge me. As soon as I hear him shout, "Hey you, come back. Who the hell do you think you are? I called the police." At the same time I hear him shout, I look at Ted, who manages to open the door and enter the house. I go in after them and enter my house. It no longer felt like my house. In just 15 minutes, while we were walking, the home invaders made a complete mess of our house. All our shelves and wardrobes were pulled out. Our clothes were scattered all over the house. Benny's dry food was all over the floor, indicating that they must have tripped his bowls, probably not knowing we owned a dog. But what scared me the most is how organised they were. I say that because after seeing the disaster they left behind, we knew that it was impossible for just one person to hold the door still and organise what they'd want to take with them. I say organised because the thieves put in our living room, all packed and ready, what they wanted, but couldn't steal it. On the couch they placed our laptops, one of our TVs, my father's collection of coins, our phones, chargers, wallets, and even my father's camera. He's a photographer, and that week he had to attend a wedding. They didn't have enough time to steal all of that, so they just settled with some of my mum's jewellery and some pocket money. After seeing this, in my silly child mind, I rushed to my room to check my piggy bank. I saved up my money from whatever chores I did. It wasn't much, but it was my work savings, and at that time I thought they stole it too. When I enter my room, I see the metal bars covering my windows are cut open and broken my windows. This is how they entered, through my room. My room is the only room facing the side of the building, and is one of the most secluded from views. Needless to say, I never felt safe in my room, in which I had to live for the next 10 years of my life until I moved out with my fiancée. The police arrives, they start throwing white dust, I have no idea what it is still, all over the house to see if they could find fingerprints. They take pictures, take our statements, analyse my room and window. They were unable to catch the home invaders, but were able to tell us that this invasion was not the only one in the neighbourhood. During that night, another 4 houses were broken into, one of them being the home of a cop, not related to the cops at our home. They told us that the invaders analysed their victims, learned their schedule, and even knew where their children's rooms were, as they seemed to be entering the houses through the children's windows. They did not expect us to be back that soon and panicked, hence why one of them was holding the door of his body so the others could flee. The person after which my dad was shouting probably was the one holding the door and escaping the last through my broken window. I don't know what could have happened if I didn't change my mind and give up on raiding for gears in PWI. I would probably have come face to face with these invaders. I'm happy that I didn't. My wife and I were looking for a used car on Craigslist and found one we were really interested in. We contacted the seller and told him we could meet him at a very public morning hour. He responded that he wouldn't be available until he got off work at 5. We agreed to meet him at the mall at 5:30. We arrived at the mall a little early, and as soon as we get there, we get a text that he's running late, so we wait and wait. Then, finally we get a text again around 6:30 that he should be at the mall soon. This was in late fall, so it was already getting dark, and we were starting to worry the mall wouldn't be very busy soon. A short while later, he texted that we should meet him at another address, about 30 minutes away in a rougher area of the city. I look up the address and see that it's a casino and gas station right off the interstate. I figure it would be busy around 7, so we head over. We pull into the parking lot and I don't see the car. My wife finally says, "Is that it?" and points to a mid-sized SUV hatchback. It certainly looked like the right car, but it was in the darkest part of the parking lot, squeezed between some parked 18-wheelers. As 2 petite women, we were very wary of going over there. We locked the doors and drove over. It was definitely the car, but it was parked in the darkest, most reclusive, least visible spot of the whole parking lot, with the hatch open. No lights were on inside the car, and no one was around the car. I stopped for a couple of seconds to see if anyone would come and greet us, and when no one did, I drove away. I parked under the casino sign, right next to the entrance of the parking lot, and texted the guy my location. He responded with, "I'm over here by the semis." We left immediately. It was all too weird. I'm not sure if this belongs here, but years ago when I was 13, I don't remember my exact age, but it was around middle school, I made a post on Craigslist advertising babysitting services as a way to make some money. The morning after I made the post, I got a phone call, no number, from a man supposedly interested in hiring. As soon as I heard his voice, I got an anxious feeling. He was whispering and talking very low and kind of slow the entire time. It was extremely off-putting. It sounded like he was middle-aged. So we exchanged hellos, and he says what he's calling about, and asks what I'm charging. Asked my name, which I would repeat over and over throughout the convo, just to add to the strangeness, my age and other details. So anyway, he says he has a young son for whom he needs a babysitter. Then he begins asking me about my experience, and then strangely diving into the lengthy description of his own life. I don't remember the details of the conversation, but I do remember one thing that he asked extremely clearly. "Now," says my name, "my son sometimes likes to touch himself. Would that bother you?" He said in a very slow, creepy voice. I just remember being filled with anxiety at that and wanting to hang up immediately. It was just sort of beyond TMI, and his voice and tone made it a lot worse. He sounded serious, but at this point I was partly convinced that this was some sort of prank, and I was almost certain that he didn't have a kid. I had no idea how to respond to that, and even though this was on the phone, me being stupid, and at that point a petrified 13-year-old kid, I just responded with, "No." And I'm sure he realised how nervous I sounded because he kind of just gave a low chuckle and continued on, because you know how boys are. Honestly, a lot of the details of that convo are blurred, and it went by fairly quickly. I just remember kind of nodding and yesing my way to the end when he asked my availability and said he would give me a call back. He ended with, "Okay, thanks," and said my name, with a little chuckle, and hung up. I can't remember whether he gave me his info or not, but I'm pretty sure he didn't call back. I do remember jumping onto my computer and taking my ad down as soon as the convo ended. I felt like complete crap after the phone call and wondered whether this was a normal discussion for an adult to try and have with a potential babysitter. Definitely glad that I never met this dude.
My life has been turned upside down and backwards many times. So many times, in fact, that I wonder why the twists seem to take the shape that it has so repetitively. With the last several years culminating in several life changes that started when I was a child. Introspection set in, and I began to really sift through the years seeking answers, or at the very least, some kind of clues. Nearly going blind will do that to you. Nearly dying several times didn't seem to be the ticket. But those are tales for another time. The differences in my life from others I know has been so dramatic that in the growing darkness of my sight, I began to try and piece things together. I was always different. Going back into my memories, the differences begin right away. No one else I know can remember their first steps, getting their diapers changed, the distaste for the feel of plastic pants over their underpants as they are potty trained, the first feel and silence of being sat in a depression of snow at 10 or 11 months. I could read well before entering kindergarten because of my mother's teachings, since she labelled everything with the same name of the thing in our shared bedroom, even in my crib. Yes, I can clearly remember those times, even the abuses my parents and elder siblings sent my way, though those didn't ramp in intensity until after I was back home and turned 6 years old. Forgive me, I'm getting slightly ahead of myself, but with reason, as you will eventually find out. As to the blindness that I avoided, which you've undoubtedly been asking yourself about, trauma-induced cataracts from concussive impacts to my head, from beatings and car accidents. No, not when I was driving. These happened when I was a child, and before the law and normal use of seatbelts stepped in to protect us from ourselves. Now, needless to say, this is all completely true. I know you'll all wonder if this is the case. As I am a child of two nations, born in the US, this means a large amount of my cultural background goes into the sum of my parts, with a Cuban father and a mother from England. You can see what an amazing contrast there would be between the two parts of my family. The differences are so vast, with one half being very spiritual, Santeria being a large part of the religious makeup of the Cuban side, and on the other is the Celtic influence of my mother's family, with deep ties to the old faiths of the islands of the United Kingdom, all the way back to the old religion of pagans and druids. As a baby, I never knew how protected I was by my tías, which means aunts in Spanish, and their diligence to keep the house that we lived in safe from the other world that they knew was there, and feared terrifically in fact. Constant blessings, use of camphor, holy water, and cleansing with incense happened all the time. They kept my dreams untroubled, and I feared the dark only because I could not see. Eventually we moved, and the home I would grow up in did not have any of those benefits, as I began to see things in the darkness most easily. Aside from feeling things, when I was near something spiritually active at a distance, I could see things too. Take for example my Uncle Mickey and his wife Olga. As a little child, we'd go there all the time because Auntie Olga was my godmother. Her mother lived with them, but had her own room, and was very old and in not the best of health. but she had an aura about her that said that she was kindly, and wished that she could do more when my brothers and sisters and I came to visit than just sit in her room or lie in bed. Sometimes, she'd be too exhausted to get out of bed, and we would have to play quietly on the other side of the house on the covered porch. I had a habit of wandering off and going places that I was told not to go, following feelings that seemed to draw me. In fact, sometimes I would wander blocks away from home or from parks, scaring my family silly. I would go to my tia Olga's mother's room, and as I'd walk in, a man standing next to her bed would look up and smile at me most of the time. My memory of him is hazy now, as it is of her, but I remember dark but warm eyes, steely grey hair swept back and slicked back down to keep it neat with a light blue guayabera. He was thick in the upper body, muscular, but not overly so. I couldn't see his lower body, since he was on the other side of the bed. She would look away from him to me, following his gaze, and see me standing in the doorway. I would greet her, "Hola, señora," and then my Uncle Mickey said something from behind me to get my attention. I'd look, to turn to see what he said, and when I'd look back, the figure, the man that I had just seen, would be gone. There was no place for him to go, I should point out, and no one else lived there since my cousin, Michael, had moved out some years before. Keep in mind these events happened when I was 4. No one would ever tell me who that was. No one wanted to even mention it. The fact is, it only started whispers between adults about the events. Fearfully whispered discussions amongst them. Discussions that I was not even allowed to think on eavesdropping on. It wasn't long after that my Aunt Olga passed away. I never found out who the man was in the room with her, but I was assuming it was someone very close to her, for the simple fact that I never felt menaced by what I saw, and the room felt brighter as she passed. My mother's relations had come to visit us for a little while, and I do believe I even got to see my great Aunt Lily more than once in the US. My mother's father, Granddad, had been setting aside money since she'd left home to have her come home, either to stay or for a long visit, and this money he'd saved up from quitting smoking. Funnily enough, he'd been saving for so long that the amount had grown high enough for us all to come visit them during the summer. My father had to work, so he couldn't come with us. His job was very demanding, and our talismans, given to us by the Cuban side of our family, were not allowed to come with us, and remained in a box back home, despite our loud protestations. My mother was most insistent, as she was embarrassed by them. My time in England was not boring. We walked everywhere, or took buses or trains, and we were dragged to every mall, castle, monument and palace of interest that my mother could think of. This is in direct contrast to the part of Los Angeles where we lived, that required a car and a long trip to get anywhere meaningful. It was a shock, to say the very least. All of this whilst travelling between homes of my granddad and Nanny, that's my grandmother, and my Aunt Sonia and Aunt Celia in various places around the country. When we first went to stay with our Aunt Celia, it was a bit of a shock. Upon first stepping through the front door and removing our Wellington boots, I noticed that the air was thick and cold. To the left of the large front door was a toilet behind a closed door under a large staircase with a banister. My eyes were drawn to it as we were led inside by my aunt, distracted with talking to my mother about her coming wedding. Another reason for our presence, so my mother would be there for her younger sister's wedding. The cold stopped as we got to the 3rd stair and turned right onto the landing and proceeded up the stairs. Now the air was just thick and unwelcoming. We were shown to our rooms, the ones that we would be sleeping in. Us children. It was across the hall from Celia's room, and next to my mother's room. I kept looking at the door to my aunt's room, a pulsing sensation in my ears and pressing on my chest. So distracted was I, that I didn't even notice I was being asked something by my mother, as she ushered me into the room to unpack. Celia smiled at me, as she opened the door to her room. Something about getting into her regular clothing, now that she was not travelling anymore that day. I looked past her into the room, with eyes wide, and the feeling of dread growing. She saw my curiosity. "What is it, Sean?" she asked. I looked past her shoulder into the room. Past her. I could see her bed and nothing else. I looked back at her as she entered the room, and then walked out of sight to the right towards what I would later learn was the walk-in wardrobe. During this, she crossed my view of the bed, and when it was clear enough again, I saw something that chilled me to the marrow, and the pressure came back enough to make me gasp. There, in the bed, now, sat an old woman in a sleeping cap and nightgown that looked like someone out of the 18th century. Her hair was grey and tied up in the cap. Her skin was parched and wrinkled. She couldn't have been older than 70. The woman was sitting there in the bed, looking in the direction that Celia had walked out of my field of view. Then slowly she turned to look at the doorway. It seemed at the time that she was turning her head at the sound of my gasp. Her eyes were angry and unwelcoming. At that moment my sister and mother walked past, breaking my line of sight. As they walked past to go down the stairs to get the rest of their suitcases and unpack, I stood frozen, my brother asking me what was wrong as they walked by. And after they'd passed, the woman was nowhere to be seen. I told no adult, nor my sister, as I remembered the response seeing things like this had gotten me in the past. I confided in my brother only, and he told me that he hadn't seen anything. He proceeded to tell my mother and sister all about it. During the rest of our stay, I kept my eyes averted from her room, so that I wouldn't have to risk seeing that woman again, and refused to use the upstairs bathroom, and I'd have to pass her and risk seeing or feeling her presence again. My grandparents' flat had no oppressive feel to it, but there was a ghost all the same. A figure would walk into the bedroom where my brother and I slept, look around, and then leave. He was dressed in an odd helmet, shaped like a brimmed soup bowl, with a chain strap and a strange heavy jacket, with leather buckles that looked water resistant. I could never see his feet, as it was always too dark in the room. As the man entered, he always seemed to bring light with him, almost as if he glowed mildly. Otherwise I would not have been able to see much of him in the middle of the night. I have no idea if I woke each time he came, but when I did wake, it was usually prefaced by that feeling that I thought my mother had just walked up to check in on my brother and I, which she did now and again. It's important to note that my mother had a fear for graveyards. She's been tracing our family tree for ages, and this meant that we were usually dragged to find headstones with her maiden name on it. One particular grave near my grandfather's flat was apparently where my great-grandparents were buried. The graveyards were never empty of people walking through and looking around. We'd be there many times, clearing the weeds and bracken from the shared grave of my great-grandparents and placing flowers there before I asked my mother why so many people were milling about. Her answer was, "I don't know, Sean, what people?" She asked as she looked around, finally paying attention to what I asked her. As the youngest in the family, I'm rarely listened to, and almost everything I say was dismissed outright or ignored. Never before had I wished that my mother had ignored my question. I looked up at the people who were walking amongst the graves and pointed at them. Specifically, I pointed to a girl with reddish hair tied up in a pink ribbon, that was wearing a light sweater and a dress that dropped to her knees. We were in our rain gear, and this girl and all the others were not. They were all in different attire. They looked dressy, such as suits and dresses, whilst others were dressed casually. Some looked like they were dressed in the current clothing style. Some were considerably older. I had not noticed it from before that moment. Further, not a single one of them had an umbrella or rain gear of any kind. It was at that moment that I realized two things. Ghosts can appear in the daylight and outside, because as a child, I assumed that being outside and being daytime meant I was safe from them, but I was wrong. These ghosts had suddenly become aware of me, all of them, as if they were discomforted at scaring me. They all turned to look at me with an impassive expression on their faces, except for the girl I pointed at, and then each of them turned away and faded from sight. It was almost as if they had pulled a screen in front of themselves, or stepped from one room to another by changing the focus of their attention. The girl with the reddish hair and the pink ribbon, she didn't disappear. Instead, she smiled and stayed fairly close, listening to our conversation and watching, all in a completely non-threatening manner. No one seemed to notice her throughout the whole time we were there, which I was eager to cut as short as possible. Threatening or not, I was leery of her and unwilling to let her be close, always keeping my mother between us. I have no idea who she was, and I was too scared to find out or even try to talk to her. Funnily enough, the church for that graveyard is where my Aunt Cecilia was married that summer. That's where my grandfather was buried when he died of a massive heart attack in his flat in August, just after my mother's birthday. And no, I never saw him again. His spirit, despite staying in the flat for many more days, never came to me. Nor, might I add, did the man in the helmet ever appear for me again. I'm sure most of this seems innocent as far from dangerous for you guys, but you have to see it from the point of view of a 5-year-old child. Not only that, you'd have to understand that before this, I'd never encountered so many so often. I'd only ever seen things swirling or faces peeking out of my closet. But there was so much to be seen in England, ever more so. Though we stayed with the relations, we never went to stay with my Uncle Billy. We did, however, get some chance to visit distant relations, distant in both lineage and in mileage. One set was in Scotland, and with nothing spiritually noteworthy to say, except that I felt safe, almost as if I were back in my old home, as though something was protecting me. But the scariest experience I had was visiting our cousins Glenys and Roy. They were a nice couple, with a home that had a past, that had no clear answer for. At my aunt's wedding, we were told by my Aunt Celia about the ghost of the bed. It was an antagonistic spirit that menaced with only male adults that slept in the bedroom, shaking them with shrieks and attacking them in other more painful ways. They look into the history of the house, and it went back about 200 years, being one of the oldest homes in Wales, with a history rich and mostly lost through time. Of course, Roy had only been told these things and never tried to sleep there himself. A friend of his had tried and left in the middle of the night, never to return. No one stepped forward with more information as to why the spirit did what it did, whether it was male or female, or what had brought its darkness into the home in the first place. All this was recounted by Celia with dark glee, as she looked onto the paranormal. Terrified at what I might end up seeing, the trip to Wales was long and arduous, as we had to stay on the train for several hours and make a few changes and then ride a bus. Before it was all over, I had been menaced by my sister and brother with the idea of ghosts in the house. Ghosts they didn't believe in or could see. Menaced with the idea of being put into a bedroom I was so scared of sleeping in. You know that's how it is with children. We're going to put you in there, Sean. We're going to make you sleep upstairs with the ghost. They'd torment me, them wailing like ghosts, holding their hands up, making poses like a revenant out for human blood. I'd wail and run, scared out of my wits, already at the knowledge that I was going to be near it. Certain, in fact, despite my mother's claims that they wouldn't, and that they wouldn't make me sleep in that accursed room. I passed out on the last bus, despite trying to stay awake in order to make sure I was able to make certain that I was not put in the wrong room. My siblings had a nasty habit that once they knew about the ghosts I could see, they'd lock me in closets just to hear me shrieking in the dark. And it was sometimes not void of others. I was scared that they would force me into the room and make me face their threats. My fears were in vain, as they never did go through with it. I awoke slowly and softly to find myself in a bed already, despite the fact that I could tell by the ambient light that it was still daytime. It was also sunny outside. I was covered in a thick blanket that almost felt as heavy as one of those lead coats they throw on you when you get an X-ray at the dentist's office. It was warm and comfortable, and for several seconds I realized where I was. Then terror blossomed in my chest as my heart began to hammer against my little ribcage. I sat up, struggling under the weight of the blanket. Sitting up, I looked around the room. The bed was old, and I could hear the spring shafts as I did. The headboard was metal, rather like the kind that you see in old movies of hospitals, but it was much larger and wider. It seemed so large to me at the time, disproportionately big for a child of my small stature. To my right was a window within the pull-down, shade drawn from the lintel to within the inch of the sill. I could tell the window was open because of the way the shade moved slightly now and then from the air flowing around it, causing the sun that was coming in to vary in intensity. Under the window was a low chest of drawers made of dark stained wood. It looked antique and sturdy, and to my left was a tall dresser that was at least 4 feet high but with no mirror on it, also made of dark stained wood, that made me feel frightened for some reason by the lack of mirror. Directly beside the bed on the left was a nightstand made of lighter wood with a single drawer in it. I heard the sound of my family downstairs laughing loudly at something. It seemed to come up to me, as if to mock me, teasing me. Almost like I were put there on purpose or to test me, to torture me and to expose my fears. But after all, to them it was not real. It was explained away as imagination. How many times by my mother since coming to England? I'd lost count, and I could hear my brother and sister laughing at something. The low voice of Roy interjecting something now and again between the bursts of laughter. Well, I thought, I'll show them. I'll get away. I'll call them stupid and mean for trying to scare me and laugh about me, always picking on me, the smallest of the family, the butt of their insults and tortures. How many times had they locked me in a closet, with things reaching for me in the dark, or in a room with ghosts that could see me as well as I could see them, all in the name of helping me get over my fears. Tears began tracing down my face as I thought of this, but now they intensified from drops to streams that blurred my sight as my horror and feeling of betrayal intensified. My cheeks were soaked and stung slightly from the hot, salty tears. I moved to get up, but paused. I felt it then. Through the whole of my body I felt it, like suddenly I was deep underwater. The pressure was intense, and almost like a nightmare in intensity. Like drowning out of water, sinking deeper and deeper every second. the crushing feeling growing tighter and tighter around me, pressing on my little chest. My shoulders creaked as they were forced into my body, and my wrists were crushed into my stomach, almost as if a gigantic hand was gripping me. Looking back now, I have no idea how I survived. I tried to move, but my arms could not defend whatever it was that held me. Another chorus of laughter from underneath the door drew my attention downwards, and I could see the gap beneath the door, with the light from the hallway illuminating a small patch of wooden carpet and the edge of the rug on which the bed sat on. Fighting to draw enough breath to scream for my mother, all I could do was sip the little air at the time into my lungs and let it out. I tried to make noise, little gasps for help, "Mummy," and calling for my sister and brother. But looking back, they couldn't have been louder than a whimper. They were far from where I was, and downstairs, and they would probably ignore me if they could, as they usually did. I felt betrayed, as well as terrified beyond comprehension, but it wasn't even close to what I was in for. A sound, distant but persistent and strange, reached my ears, and then in the silence of the room, it didn't echo. It seemed as though the sound was sucked away as soon as each sound finished. It grew steadily louder, and by the time I could tell it was getting closer, the grip hadn't lessened on me, and in fact, began to push down so my little legs were bent at painful angles on the bed. The springs squeaked in response to my downwards pressure into the bed, and then I heard my mother say, "I think I heard Sean upstairs. I'll check on him later," going to step out for a cigarette, and it trailed off, as she must have gone outside. The sound of the door opening and closing, and then silence. They had all stepped outside, and I could now hear the sound of my brother and sister laughing distantly from the open window to my right. My right hip protested, the pain of being crushed in the semi-sitting position with my right leg splayed out on the right, and my left extended in front of me. The noise I'd heard now seemed emboldened at being alone in the house. I could finally tell, at last, what it sounded like. It was like a groan, only it sounded like a person groaning whilst inhaling rather than exhaling. And it didn't stop this time. It was inhaling and making the sound, getting louder and louder and closer, but I couldn't see from where. My eyes were now rolling around my sockets, searching every corner of the room to see if I could find the source of the sound, all whilst my mind was crying for my mother, my tears now soaking through the neck of my polo shirt in front of my chest. The groan stopped for an instant, and then began again, louder this time, as I sensed it was very near. I looked down at the doorway. Something had attracted my attention despite the new burning pain in my chest. What attracted my gaze was the light from under the doorway, which was slowly going out. It was being blotted out, as if by shadows or something moving over the source of the left of the door to cover the light. Eventually the light was absorbed by a solid line of shadow, and I knew it could not have been a person. A person could not make this kind of completely eclipsing shadow over the light. There would be a shape of feet or legs or something. The sound was now just outside the wooden door, louder than before, and something more. It was not a single groan. It was the sound of several people. No, a chorus of them. And it sounded now almost like a painful gasping into air-starved lungs. Only it never paused to finish, taking the perpetual inward breath. The groan didn't sound like it stemmed from pain. No. It sounded almost like an engine getting going, as if it was drawing something it wanted into it. The louder it got, the more I hurt at the pressure of the crushing sensation. As I watched, the shadow over the light was taken by something darker, and it began to slide under the door. It was darker and fuller than before. I could see an amorphous mass sliding underneath the door that was darker than midnight, and it entered the room. The sunlight that came in and around the shade in the window grew dimmer. The pressure on my chest surged angrily as I was suddenly flung back in the bed and banged my head against the slated metal headboard, which in turn smashed the wall. The sound of it, though, should have been loud, but it sounded like a muffled clunk to me, as if the sound had been sucked away or muffled underwater or with a pillow. My head, now dazed from the collision, was too loopy and weak from lack of oxygen to appreciate the reality that I could now breathe. All thoughts of escape had long gone, and I wanted my mother to come and rescue me, to drive it off and protect me, to enfold me in her arms. But I realized that this would not happen. Despite her promises, she put me here and allowed me to be in there, and either way, she didn't really care about me. Blarily turning my gaze downwards, I watched the foot of the bed for signs as I prayed. Let me die fast so it can't touch me or take me. Please just let me die. I was so scared that all my limbs had gone cold from shock. The groaning started at an all-new intensity, revving upwards in the chorus of sounds, and my eyes grew wider in terror as the dark mass now surged upwards in the air as if standing. And it didn't even stop. It stood all spread out as if oozing into the air, sucking the warmth and oxygen from the room, the light growing dimmer and darker as I laid there, numbly panting in ultimate terror. My thighs grew hot as my urine burst free into my jeans and ran out of my pants and onto the bedding. The groaning changed, as if almost overjoyed, a triumphant tone, and it spread to the right and left like bat wings, reaching around to engulf me in its wicked hungry embrace. Please, 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 please. I realized I was panting, begging as my tears blurred my vision. The mass moved to the bed, and it slowly began to engulf me. All I heard was the groaning. It filled my ears, and then seemed to crawl into my head and echo there. A fresh weave of tears made it all, so I saw a blur and the cold feeling in all my limbs. My head propped at a strange angle against the headboard, forcing me to watch as it closed in. The anticipation of its icy touch on my already cold skin repulsed me, and I began to shiver uncontrollably. Then, just before I knew it was going to touch me, my vision cleared, and I could see that it was about to touch my shoulders and embrace me. The noise it made surged one last time, bestial sounds of the predator about to make a kill. But it was all suddenly blotted out of the intense, white-hot agony on the top of my head. A burning, watery feeling that was very intense happened at the top of my head. Wave upon wave of heat. An agony, like the top of my head had just been sawed open with a welding torch. But it didn't fade, and it was as if the room filled up with blinding white light, so bright that my eyes had automatically been drawn to slits to protect them. The whole room was filled with it, except for the Stygian patch of nightmare before me on the bed. It had halted in mid-reach and was now illuminated completely. I could somehow tell it was in pain. Now I could see it entirely, and I wished to heavens I never did. The thing was made up of the faces, images and bodies, all black against black but easily discernible, all caught mid-scream or wail or groan, in some position of pain or writhing, contorted in agony, moving slowly within the mass, undulating to the tone of their own trapped misfortune, all moulded together into a thin sheet of ultimate darkness, pressed into a fabric of utter damnation. This thing wanted me to be part of it. I just knew it. And though what it was may have once been human and had the potential for love and mercy, all that was left was the desire to add more to its flock of tortured souls. I have realized since then that the faces I saw, the darkness that it was It was all merely a covering for the real force behind it, the thing hiding behind the curtain of souls. The light in the room intensified, and the burn to my scalp lessened at last, allowing me to move slightly. The mass leapt off the bed and seemed to be sucked under the door, all while thrashing left and right. It passed into the hallway, and the groaning sound receded as sounds from the outside and the light returned to the room. I could hear my siblings playing and my mother talking to Glynis about something. The light was dimming finally, and I looked around the room to see where it was coming from, weakly swiveling my head to try and find the glimpse of the source. But it was against the wall. Nothing should have been able to be behind me, and that's exactly where it always seemed to be. My strength, what little the light had imparted, was flooding out of me rapidly. The thing was gone, and I wanted to escape and get out of the room. Now, reaching my right arm to the left edge of the bed, I tried to grab onto it and pull myself out. I failed as the last of the light and the burning sensation fled me. I tumbled out of bed, heading onto the floor. I don't remember hitting the floor. In fact, I don't remember what happened for the next 3 days. My next memories were that, heading away from the train station in her town and on our way to her house. It took a long time to piece together the story, but here's what I know. They thought I'd fallen out of bed after peeing on it on the first day. I'd gotten up, cleaned myself off, and my mother found me half-clothed trying to change the sheets. They fed us supper. I ate heartily at the wonderful food that Glynis had cooked, and then we'd gone to bed. Throughout it all, I acted normally. That was that, but I remembered none of it. Perhaps it was the shock. What I do remember was eating the Welsh cakes that Glynis had made herself. Even made me a snack to eat. That my brother didn't like them, and that my sister was trying to stay in shape for gymnastics. You can say I'm delusional, or that I'm not sane. You can say anything you like. I was never more scared than I was that day. Because I was a little boy, but I know what I saw. In case you're wondering, did it stay in that house? No. In fact, Glynis and Roy said that after we were there, during a visit to the US before they moved to New Zealand, someone across the street had died, and they figured it had gone to follow the person. Roy slept in the room once to make sure nothing had happened. I had a different take on things, but never spoke to them of what I knew. Wasn't worthwhile telling them that the thing followed me and made my life hell. Guilt never solved anything. I don't know what it was, I didn't care to name it. Give it a name if you need one, I couldn't care less. What I do care about is from that day, my life went different. It couldn't get to me, so my family turned dark. I don't know if it was the thing that wouldn't let the people sleep, or the tale that we were told. What I care about is that my family went from being what it was, to cruel and vicious. After we came home, the darkness got to my father. I know this because he beat me until I was unable to control my body function, and even gave me a concussion. All on Christmas Day of 1977. Merry Christmas. And why? Because I accidentally opened the wrong present. Car accidents followed. My father began to drive angry, regularly. I nearly went through a windshield with a full backpack at age 9. The only thing stopping me was the fact that the window wasn't made to shatter. 1970s construction, gotta love it. My mother began to regularly dish out damage to me, because my siblings would blame me for things and wanted to see me get punished. My siblings began to use me as a whipping boy when they were upset. It made me feel worthless, and I withdrew from their presence as much as I could. This seemed to make them more antagonistic. My brother acted as if he were always being edged on to find anything that he could to get away with hitting me on the head with. This even included putting a metal nut on his finger and lashing out at my head when no one was looking, especially the top of my head. Complaining to my mother was useless. The only solace I had in this time came from my Cuban grandfather Papacito. He would protect me when I was near him. I was safest from all of them. Naturally, this dark thing made sure he was gone as soon as possible. My parents divorced suddenly, and my mother drove off my aunts and grandparents. Despite the fact that they lived next door to us, she found a way to make them move. After that point, cataracts started to form, and though I could see spiritual things somewhat as dim outlines, I could not see them as clearly as before. No longer did they look like normal people. Now I have ocular implants, and I can see as well as any of you can see. Mostly. A few more laser treatments, and no more cataracts. And my ability to see ghosts is as it was when I was 5. I know this because I was shopping one day after my first surgery, and left my eye unbandaged 2 days prior. A little girl ran past me, giggling, and knocked over produce as I watched, then ran through a cart loaded with produce as if it wasn't there. The person stocking the produce, a little dour-looking Hispanic lady, never looked up to follow her. She only humphed in annoyance and picked up the peppers, putting them back where they belonged. I asked if she saw the girl, and she gave me a puzzled look. You may be wondering, does misfortune follow me still? And are my steps dodged by this thing? No. Thankfully it's gone now, and with good reason I might add. But that, as they say, is another story.